When we talk about the shifts happening across the world today, it's not just about power changing hands. It's about an entirely new game being played. And one of the most defining moments in this transition was when China stepped onto the field, not just as a participant, but as a player rewriting the rules. For years we saw China as the factory of the world, as a quiet, economic giant focused inward. But that version of China doesn't exist anymore. That China has evolved. What we're seeing now is a nation that's no longer content with watching from the sidelines. China changed the game, and the world felt it, especially in places already on edge like Israel. The shift wasn't sudden, it was precise, calculated, strategic. China didn't come charging in with tanks or shockwaves. Instead, it moved like a grandmaster in a high-stakes chess match. First, with infrastructure diplomacy, the Belt and Road Initiative, which spread like roots through Asia, Africa, and Europe. It wasn't just about roads and ports, it was about relationships, influence, access. China wasn't merely building projects, it was building leverage. Countries that once looked west for aid and alliances started looking east. And when those deals came with fewer lectures about internal politics or human rights, many took the offer. And then there was technology. For decades, the global tech narrative was Silicon Valley's story. But in recent years, China flipped that. It became the epicenter of innovation in everything from AI to digital finance. And with that came a new kind of power, not just military or economic, but narrative power. The ability to shape how people think, what they see, and what they believe. It was soft power, coded into apps and fiber cables, and it spread without needing permission. Diplomatically, China began stepping into spaces previously dominated by the United States or Europe. It started brokering deals, offering to mediate conflicts, and creating its own platforms for global cooperation. And while many were skeptical at first, some were simply exhausted by the old ways. In places like the Middle East, where promises from the West had grown stale or failed, China's calm, non-interventionist tone sounded like a fresh alternative. And when it engaged with Iran and Saudi Arabia, helping open dialogue where others had failed, the world took notice. It was no longer just participating in global politics, it was influencing outcomes. Now let's be clear. This wasn't about China being perfect or universally admired. No nation is. But what's undeniable is that China began acting with a new kind of confidence, a quiet assertiveness that made other powers nervous. It wasn't about loud declarations. It was about showing up, holding firm, and offering alternatives in a world tired of binary choices. And as those ripples reached the Middle East, they collided with one of the most fragile, volatile, and emotionally charged landscapes on Earth, Israel. When China changed the game, Israel found itself in unfamiliar territory. For decades it had operated with the understanding that the US was the center of gravity, that Washington's backing was not just strategic, it was existential. But suddenly, that center was shifting. China's influence wasn't just economic, it was changing alliances, shifting loyalties, creating new diplomatic triangles that Israel wasn't a part of. And as this new order began to take shape, the certainty Israel once had started to blur. There was confusion among leaders, among citizens. What does it mean when the world's fastest growing power isn't concerned with your traditional talking points? When a superpower doesn't frame its interest in you through a historical or religious lens, but purely through strategy and access? It was disorienting. Israel, so used to being a pivotal piece on the global chessboard, suddenly realized the board itself was being redesigned. The anxiety wasn't just about China's rise. It was about what that rise revealed: a world in flux, alliances in question, and a future that couldn't be predicted by looking at the past. China didn't just insert itself into the global conversation, it changed the terms of that conversation. And in doing so, it exposed just how fragile the old order really was. We're not just watching history unfold, we're living inside a recalibration. One where influence is no longer inherited, it's earned, often quietly, often without fanfare. And when a power like China rises not with bombs, but with bandwidth and banknotes, it doesn't just challenge other nations. It destabilizes the assumptions they've built their security on. As China stepped up and began reshaping the global balance, something else was happening in parallel, something just as significant, but far more unsettling for those who had grown used to being in control. The United States, once the uncontested leader of the international order, began to falter, not in power necessarily, but in clarity, in purpose, in influence. And that loss of direction, that slow fading of certainty, sent shockwaves around the world. None more profound than the chaos it sparked in regions that had long depended on American leadership. Israel was one of them. You could feel it, not just in policy rooms or intelligence briefings, but in the air. For decades, Israel operated with a kind of strategic confidence rooted in a simple truth: the US had its back. That alliance wasn't just military or economic. It was deeply emotional, forged through shared interests, yes, but also through shared mythologies. American presidents from both parties visited the Western Wall. Congress applauded Israeli leaders like family, aid flowed, intelligence was exchanged, red lines were drawn, and the assumption was if Israel crossed the line, Washington would protect it, or at least cushion the blow. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that dynamic began to shift. The American voice that once carried moral authority and geopolitical weight began to sound uncertain. Foreign policy became reactive instead of proactive. Domestic divisions spilled into international affairs. Allies started wondering not just if the US could help them, but whether it even understood what it wanted for itself anymore. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan wasn't just a logistical mess. It was a symbolic moment. It told the world, in no uncertain terms, the US might not stay the course anymore. It might leave. And when that message spread, it hit hard in the Middle East. This region, already a tangled web of rivalries and fragile agreements, relies on stability, at least in the form of predictable alliances. But predictability started disappearing. American involvement, once constant and deeply engaged, became selective, even hesitant. At times, Washington condemned actions it had previously defended. At others, it sat silently while allies faced existential threats. The message became confusing. Especially for Israel. Was America still the anchor it had always been, or was it becoming a question mark? This uncertainty created a dangerous vacuum. And nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. Into that space stepped new players: China, of course, but also Russia, regional powers like Iran and Turkey, and even non-state actors emboldened by the blurred lines of power. With the US no longer setting the tone, everyone started improvising. And in that improvisation, the old rules collapsed. For Israel, the impact was immediate and deeply disorienting. It suddenly found itself in a world where the traditional fallback, call Washington, get support, was no longer a guarantee. American political shifts meant that Israel could no longer rely on bipartisan backing. One administration's friend could be the next administration's frustration. The once solid foundation of support was cracking under the weight of inconsistency and internal division. And while Israel still maintained military strength and intelligence capabilities, it was no longer sure if that strength could be counted on to deter enemies the way it used to. Internally, this created confusion and anxiety. Israeli leaders debated their strategies more fiercely. Should they pivot toward new alliances? Should they double down on self-reliance? Should they try to court powers like China or Russia? Even if those relationships came with strings and uncertainty, none of the options were comfortable. But the comfort of the past had already disappeared. What made it worse was that this unraveling happened at a time when regional threats were growing more sophisticated. Iran's influence was expanding. Terror networks were adapting. And all of it was unfolding in an environment where American involvement could no longer be assumed, and where China's involvement was calculated but detached. Israel was no longer just facing enemies, it was facing a new kind of geopolitical loneliness. And that's when chaos began to take root. Not necessarily in the form of full-blown war, but in the erosion of certainty, in the questions that had no clear answers, in the alliances that now required recalibration, caution, and risk. The old balance, America as the protector, Israel as the fortified outpost of Western ideals in the East, no longer held. And when the balance breaks, everything wobbles. It's important to understand that this wasn't just about one country losing influence and another gaining it. This was about a broader psychological shift. For decades, the global order was built on the idea that someone was in charge. Someone with values, with clarity, with power. But when the one who was in charge starts second-guessing itself, others start second-guessing everything. That's what made it so chaotic for Israel. It wasn't just a strategic crisis. It was an existential one. It forced a nation built on vigilance to question its core assumptions about security, about partnership, about permanence. The game had changed, but the real shock came not just from who was rising, but from who was stepping back. While the global chessboard was being flipped, while China was rising with quiet confidence, and the United States was retreating with visible uncertainty, there was another storm brewing. Not across oceans or between superpowers, but inside a nation that had long believed it could survive anything: Israel. And yet, as the world changed around it, Israel was facing its own reckoning, not from an enemy at the gate, but from within its own walls. Israel has always lived under pressure. That's never been a secret. A nation surrounded by complex relationships, fragile truces, and hostile rhetoric doesn't get the luxury of complacency. But there's a difference between pressure and fracture, between resilience and chaos. What we witnessed, what we are still witnessing, is a slow unraveling of the unity that once held the Israeli state together even under fire. Because when external certainties start to fade, when old alliances weaken, when the global order reshapes itself, the pressure on internal systems intensifies. And in Israel, those internal systems were already strained. The political landscape in Israel has grown increasingly volatile over the past several years. Governments have risen and fallen in rapid succession. Coalitions are patched together not through shared vision, but through desperation to hold power, even temporarily. Leaders cycle through office while fundamental issues remain unresolved. National strategy has given way to political survival. And when leadership becomes fragmented, so too does the sense of national direction. It's not just about who holds the office of prime minister. It's about whether the people believe anyone truly leads. And that belief, more than any policy, is what sustains a country through uncertainty. In Israel, that belief has been steadily corroded, not because people stopped caring, but because they stopped trusting. When every election feels like a referendum on identity rather than direction, when every major decision becomes a proxy war between religious and secular, left and right, Jew and Arab, then it's not strategy anymore, it's survival politics. And survival politics leaves no room for clarity. When political energies are consumed with staying in power rather than preparing for the future, the country drifts. Strategic planning becomes reactive. Military decisions become political footballs. Social cohesion weakens as each group sees the other not as fellow citizens, but as obstacles. This isn't just about governance. It's about the soul of a nation being torn in too many directions to move forward. Now imagine that internal fragmentation at the very moment when the external world becomes more unpredictable than ever. The United States is no longer the steadfast anchor it once was. China is rising, but not in a way that naturally embraces Israel as a priority partner. Regional alliances shift daily, and even the Abraham Accords, once hailed as a new dawn, are now part of a complicated dance involving new global players and quiet calculations. All of that change demands a clear national compass. But Israel, in its current state, is struggling to find one. This internal disarray isn't lost on the outside world either. Rivals watch Israel's domestic divisions closely, waiting for moments of weakness. Allies grow more hesitant, unsure if the Israel they once knew is still the one they can depend on. And within Israel, citizens are asking harder questions. About who they are, about what kind of democracy they live in, about whether unity is even possible when society itself seems divided by class, ethnicity, religion, and ideology. You can feel the anxiety in the streets. It's not just about fear of rockets or regional war, though that remains ever present. It's about something deeper, something harder to name. A sense that the ground beneath the country's identity is no longer solid. And that kind of uncertainty is the most dangerous of all, because it breeds paralysis. And in a region where movement equals survival, paralysis is fatal. We need to understand that chaos doesn't always come with fire and rubble. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of disconnection. When people stop believing their institutions represent them. When the public debate becomes so toxic that no bridge feels strong enough to hold both sides. When strategy is no longer debated on its merits, but weaponized for votes. That's when the real danger sets in. Because a nation that can't align itself from within will always struggle to respond to threats from beyond. And that's exactly what happened. As China rose, as the US faltered, as global alliances swirled in unpredictable patterns, Israel needed clarity. It needed steadiness. It needed internal unity to face external change. But instead, it faced a mirror. And what stared back wasn't strength, but fragmentation. That is how chaos took hold. Something profound is happening right now. Something bigger than just the rise of one nation or the fall of another. We are standing inside the early stages of a new world order. And no one, no government, no military, no ideology, is fully prepared for what that actually means. Because this isn't just about new alliances being formed or old ones breaking down. This is about the rules themselves being rewritten. The old structures that held the world in place, those pillars built after World War II, reinforced through Cold War strategy, global finance, military dominance, and Western ideals, they're cracking. And through those cracks, something new is emerging, a world that is no longer centered around one power, or even two, but shaped by the friction, competition, and unpredictability of many. For decades we understood the game. There was a global referee, so to speak. The United States called the plays, enforced the norms, shaped the flow of money, technology, diplomacy. And while many resented that dominance, they also relied on its consistency. It kept borders in check, secured trade routes, and guaranteed that certain lines wouldn't be crossed without consequence. But now, That consistency is gone. Not only has China risen, not only has the US receded in certain arenas, but more importantly, the world has stopped waiting for someone to lead. Countries are acting for themselves, often unpredictably, and often in direct conflict with one another's goals. It's no longer a matter of East versus West. It's everyone trying to win their own version of the future. This isn't just geopolitical theory. This is real. You can see it on the ground. In Africa, where foreign powers compete not just for resources but for influence over governments and values. You can see it in Southeast Asia, where nations are carefully walking the line between Chinese investment and American security. You can see it in Latin America, where the idea of non-alignment is back, not as a passive stance, but as a strategy. And you can see it in the Middle East, where deals are brokered between unlikely partners, and where traditional enemies find themselves rethinking old assumptions. But here's the truth. Multipolarity, this idea of a world with many centers of power, doesn't automatically bring stability. In fact, at first it brings confusion. It brings miscommunication, miscalculation, and increased risk. Because when no single player sets the tone, everyone plays their own tune, and the result isn't harmony, it's noise. Without agreed upon rules, without trusted enforcers, conflicts escalate faster. Agreements are more fragile, loyalties shift, and the space between diplomacy and war becomes dangerously thin. For Israel, this new reality is more than a diplomatic challenge, it's an existential one. Because Israel's strategy has long been built around predictability, around knowing where power lies and how to align with it. But what happens when that power is no longer centralized? When the world becomes a series of competing interests with no common vision? Suddenly, strategy becomes improvisation. And improvisation is not a position of strength when you live in a region where one mistake can be catastrophic. It's not just Israel, of course. Every nation is now facing a more complex set of calculations. It's not enough to know who your allies are. You also need to know who your allies' allies are, and who might switch sides when it's convenient. We're entering a period where interests are fluid, where loyalties are shallow, and where global decisions are shaped not by a single ideology, but by immediate necessity. And there's something deeper at play here. People across the world are beginning to sense that the old promises no longer hold, that the stability they were raised to expect, from their economies, from their governments, from the international community, has been replaced by something more unstable, more improvisational. Leaders are responding to that by retreating into nationalism, protectionism, and unilateral decisions. But those responses only further destabilize the whole system. In this new world, no one gets to be passive. No country gets to sit comfortably on old alliances or past achievements. Everyone is being tested by uncertainty, by shifting loyalties, by new threats that don't follow traditional rules. Cyber warfare, misinformation, proxy conflicts, economic coercion, these are now front-line weapons. And the line between peace and crisis is no longer marked by armies, but by algorithms and stock prices. The game has changed, and it's still changing. There's no fixed outcome, no clear winner. But one thing is certain: the nations that cling to the past, that build strategy around assumptions that no longer apply, will find themselves lost. The future will belong to those who can adapt, not just to power, but to complexity, to a world that is no longer orderly, but dynamic. And in that world, survival won't be about strength alone. It will be about understanding that the center no longer holds, because there is no center, there are only moving pieces.